Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Telegram, Twitter, and Facebook. You can support me on Subscribestar, Buy Me a Coffee, and Locals. And also don't forget to check out my Substack. Now, again, with our resident Lovecraft expert, the Doosman, we are going to cover the themes and ideas of the Lovecraft dream cycle. Now, why the dream cycle? I think the dream cycle is important for two reasons. One of the main characters of the dream cycle is Randolph Carter, who is in many ways Lovecraft's admitted alter ego. And so we sort of get a sense of what Lovecraft believed and what Lovecraft was trying to get out of his work. Contrasting that with the Cthulhu mythos, which is more cosmic horror, we see that the dream cycle does have elements of cosmic horror, but it also has elements of a sort of poetic, aristocratic, spiritual aspect of, like, the old New England gentry that, of course, Lovecraft saw himself as a last scion of, and creates for a very different impression than the Cthulhu mythos. You have said in private, the dream cycle is white-pilled Lovecraft, the Cthulhu mythos is black-pilled Lovecraft, and that's pretty apt description. And we're going to begin with a reading or partial reading of the Silver Key, because it basically talks about some of his the basic principles, I think, that we can derive from of Lovecraft's own belief system himself and the broader purpose of the dream cycle. In the first days of his bondage, he had turned to the gentle churchly faith endeared to him by the naive trust of his fathers, for thence stretched mystic avenues which seemed to promise escape from life. Only on closer view did he mark the starved fancy and beauty, the stale and prosy triteness, and the owlish gravity and grotesque claims of solid truth, which resigned boresomely and overwhelmingly amongst most of its professors, or feel to the full the awkwardness with which it sought to keep alive as literal fact the outgrown fears and guesses of a primal race confronting the unknown. It wearied Carter to see how solemnly people tried to make earthly reality out of old myths, which every step of their boasted science confuted, and this misplaced seriousness killed the attachment he might have kept for their ancient creeds had they been content to offer these sonorous rites and emotional outlets in their true guise of ethereal fantasy. But when he came to study those who had thrown off the old myths, he found them even more ugly than those who had not. They did not know that beauty lies in harmony, and that loveliness of life has no standard amidst an aimless cosmos, save only its harmony with the dreams and the feelings which have gone before and blindly molded our little spheres out of the rest of chaos. They did not see that good and evil and beauty and ugliness are only ornamental fruits of perspective, whose sole value lies in the linkage to what chance made our fathers think and feel, and whose finer details are different for every race and culture. Instead, they either denied these things altogether or transferred them to the crude, vague instincts which they shared with the beasts and peasants, so that their lives were dragged malodorously out in pain, ugliness, and disproportion, and yet filled with ludicrous pride at having escaped from something no more unsound than that which still held them. They had traded the false gods of fear and piety for those of the license and anarchy. Carter did not taste deeply of these modern freedoms, for their cheapness and squalor sickened a spirit-loving beauty alone, while his reason rebelled at the flimsy logic with which their champions turned to gild brute impulses with sacredness stripped from their idols they had discarded. He saw that most of them, in common with their cast-off priestcraft, could not escape from the delusion that life has meaning apart from that which men dream into it, and could not lay aside the crude notion of ethics and obligations beyond those of beauty. Even all nature shrieked of its unconsciousness and impersonal unmorality in light of the scientific discoveries. Warped and bigoted with preconceived illusions of justice, freedom, and consistency, they cast off the old lore and the old ways with old beliefs, nor stopped to think that the lore of those days were the sole makers of the present thoughts and judgments, and the sole guides and standards in a meaningless universe without fixed aims or stable points of reference. Having lost these artificial settings, their lives grew void of direction and dramatic interest, till at length they strove down their ennui in bustle and pretended usefulness, noise and excitement, barbaric display and animal sensation. When these things palled, disappointed, or grew nauseous, through revulsion, they cultivated irony and bitterness, and found fault with the social order. Never could they realize that their brute foundations were as shifting and contradictory as the gods of their elders, and that the satisfaction of the moment is the bane of the next. Calm, lasting beauty comes only in dream, and the solace the world had thrown away when in its worship of the real, it threw away the secrets of childhood and innocence. Well, there's a lot there, but what are your thoughts on that, the Doomsman?
Well, there is a lot there. It is a very condensed statement of things that people generally in a traditional or right-wing sphere would believe, I would say. He covers, well, in that first paragraph, he's talking about the insufficiency that he found in religion, right? But it seems that his particular issue is the lack of mystery. So this seems to be with the loss of a sort of initiatic aspect to it, which is a criticism you get from Evola as well about Christianity. And he, in positive comparison, talks about various initiatic orders within Christianity, such as the Ghibellines. So that is interesting. Moving on from there, he mentions about the good and evil, beauty and ugliness are only ornamental fruits of perspective, and how these grew out of individual races and cultures, which is a very Spenglerian point. So you could see this is almost like a blast through some of the major thinkers of our sphere here.
Yeah, and also, if you could mute yourself when I'm talking, I'm getting a feedback. But the other thing too is he mentions, okay, so what he's opposed to with religion is it sounds like a kind of fundamentalism, because he says, it wearied Carter to see how solemnly people tried to make earthly reality out of old myths, which every step of their boasted science confuted, and this misplaced seriousness killed the attachment he might have kept for the ancient creeds. So so this is interesting, right? In one sense, Lovecraft is conservative, even reactionary, but he also believes in the quote truths of science, and this represents a kind of late 19th, early 20th century conservatism, which continued down to our own day, represented, say, in England by the likes of Roger Scruton, where there's this tension between the conservative trilogy of the good, the beautiful, and the true, but also accepting what science, quote unquote, reveals about the world, which seems to kind of undercut all of those things. Now, what Randolph Carter is doing, and I think by extension Lovecraft, is he's sort of like cutting the Gordian knot and just saying that, okay, what we have to then do, and you mentioned this before in a private conversation, in a sort of Nietzschean fashion, create our own ethics. And the ethics that he creates is the exaltation of beauty and dreams.
Yeah, and in particular, he touches there on the different spheres, right? There's one word choice in the excerpt you read. Let me see if I can find it. Yes, it wearied Carter to see how solemnly people tried to make earthly reality out of old myths, and so on. Earthly reality, I think, is the operative phrase there. That he's not saying that the science is wrong or that the myths are wrong, but they operate in different spheres. And it's this attempt, this universalizing impulse that is what is causing problems here.
Yeah, and then also the idea that in doing away with the myths and the legends of, in this case, a Christian past of his contemporaries, and what they've replaced it with is nothing better. We can think of the commentary, of course, of Nietzsche, where I think it's in Twilight of the Idols, he talks about how once you've dispensed with Christianity, you can't hold on to Christian ethics because the very preconditions for Christian ethical thought go away. And you also have Max Stirner in The Ego and His Own, who says that, our atheists are the most pious people. Rank sarcasm, because, again, there's no basis for this. And Lovecraft, now he's not criticizing this from an amoralist perspective. He's not Nietzschean or Stirnerite in this regard, but he sees the same thing. You've done away with those beliefs that can ground your life in meaning, and yet you still want to hold on to it. And he's like, you can't do that. So that does put him in the same category as Nietzsche and just mentioned it. I can't think of it now. The
Stirner.
Thank you. It was on their ass. Yeah, and so, but he's coming at it from a more positive rather than negative angle because he wants to sort of, well, I guess you could say Nietzsche does too, wants to restore a sense of value. But for a Lovecraft, this restoring of a sense of value is sort of transcending through thought the mundane ugliness of life, and we really see that with I think it's Cellophase, right? That's where we're introduced to Curanos, and he ends up, spoiler alert, dying at the end, but then becoming king and god of a dream world. So he completes the ascension into Dreamland by completely dying in this world.
Yeah, that's right. I was just looking up my notes on Karanes here, or on Cellophase. Yeah, it says of Karanes there, he did not care for the ways of people about him, and then later, Karanes was not modern and did not think like others who wrote. So Karanes also seems to be a sort of man out of time character. Uh, I suppose all dreamers are, and in fact, through the gates of the Silver Key, kind of gets to the point that what dreamers are doing is transcending time. That time is time in the three-dimensional view of the universe that we have are sort of accidents of our particular perspective and are not representative of reality as a whole.
Yes, and and you pointed this out in our last episode that there's not a hard break between the Cthulhu mythos and the dream cycle, where we're introduced to Randolph Carter in the statement of Randolph Carter. And of course, Curanos, who's introduced in Cellophase, also appears in the Dream Quest for Unknown Kadath. He also comes from our world. So it's there's like the world of the early 20th century. Both the Cthulhu mythos and the dream cycle are fundamentally rooted in. Both are sort of parallel existences that one can fall into or be exposed to within the Cthulhu mythos. And so Randolph Carter, in one sense, is exposed to both because when Harley Warren goes underground and confronts whatever madness there is, that madness is on the other end of the telephone, and answers, says, "You fool, Harley Warren is dead." And so he's experienced both. But here's the thing: it seems though that depending on how we want to weigh these things, the power of dream is more powerful than the Cthulhu mythos. So, for example, Nyarlathotep is introduced in the dream cycle, but he's also referenced elsewhere. But he's defeated by Nodens, who is only really mentioned in the Silver Key, and then I think what was it? The Strange High House.
Strange High House, yeah.
Yeah, but so it's interesting, right? Nodens seems to be an expression of pure dream, whereas Nyarlathotep is both in the Cthulhu mythos and the dream world.
Yeah, I'm trying to find a good term for the dream world or the world including the dream world. I would like to say hyper reality, but that's kind of a term of art that means a different thing. It seems to me though is it's a more inclusive view of reality. It includes the Cthulhu mythos, but isn't limited by it. So sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, yeah, it rises above it because, for example, Nyarlathotep is included in the Dreams of the Witch House, a classic Cthulhu mythos story. And so what is that telling us? Is Lovecraft telling us then that whatever horrors await us in the universe, that this higher dreamland trumps it?
I think so, and that would be why we could consider it white-pilled as opposed to black-pilled, right? In that there is this view of reality which is not limited by the crude material ugliness that he's kind of railing against here, that it seems to partake of the transcendent. And perhaps, we were speaking earlier about Through the Gates of the Silver Key and how E. Hoffman Price was a Platonist, you were saying, and perhaps some of that is coming through. But I do think that goes to the overall optimism of the story, in that the beauty in Dream seems to be unrestrained by the material ugliness, and the material ugliness is pretty horrifying. It's a root of a lot of the horror that he writes about.
Yeah, exactly. So, and again, I still am just sort of struck at how even like Lovecraft scholarship, like there was the quote new atheist St. Joshi, who became famous as an authoritative Lovecraftian scholar. He even wrote a official biography, and I used to follow him and some. The guy named Price, I think, also, who was a Lovecraft scholar, also new atheist. They very seldom mention the dream cycle. And I guess that's because they're new atheists and they resonate more with the cosmic horror of the Cthulhu mythos. But it's strange to me that they don't, because of the unique qualities that the dream cycle has. And I think also a good example of this like conquest, this essence of beauty. Well, actually, all of what we just talked about in that opening segment is encapsulated in the quest of Iranon, because Iranon travels to find beauty, the lands from where he came from, but it's just one giant loop that he's on, and that kind of ties into the dream quest of Unknown Kadath, because Randolph Carter is only trying to find where he came from. But one of the things is, in the quest for Iranon, he gets a follower who then, in one of the cities, becomes a dissolute drunk and then dies, and Iranon has to keep moving, which seems to be the kind of character Carter's describing, who just resorts to irony and doesn't see things for what they are. And so this idea has been around, brooding in Lovecraft. So Quest of Iranon is 1920, or 21 rather. And the Silver Key is 1926. So he's been working on this theme for a while.
That's a good point about the quest of Iranon, in that he is yearning. So he knows he's trying to return to his youth, right? That's his stated goal, is that I'm from this beautiful place. Does he know the name? Yeah, Ira, something like that. So this is what he's singing songs about, right? He's like a traveling bard type of character that sings these beautiful songs of this land of his youth that he doesn't know how to find. And he doesn't age while on the quest. What do you make of that? Of the fact that he doesn't age, that he's kind of this perennial youth? Because of course, well, ultimately he does age, but only after the dream is broken.
Well, doesn't he age after his colleague dies?
Not immediately. He doesn't age until he happens upon someone who tells him, who like knew him as a youth, and says, "You're the place you're talking. Like, yes. I know who you are. Yeah, the place you're looking for doesn't exist. You're from here." Yeah.
Oh, that's right. Maybe he ages when he comes to the realization.
It could be that he has a very childlike manner. Iranon does, like when he is. Yes, his view of one of the towns they visit is called Teloth. And all of the places they go to are kind of crude caricatures of places. They have a few very extreme aspects to them. They don't seem like full views of life, which I suppose is also how a child would see things, right? Kind of without high resolution. So this town Teloth, there is no play. They only work. Like all they do is work there. And then they go on to Unai, which is the place where his friend becomes a dissolute drunkard. All they do there is party. And he seems to be going through these different maybe aspects of reality, and none of them are what he's looking for, right? Because he's still searching for his home.
Yeah, exactly. And the quest, like I said, the quest of Iranon. Well, it also, see, this I think is what a lot of scholarship has missed about Lovecraft. Both those who are sort of like critical of Lovecraft for a lot of the beliefs that he has that don't fit well in a modern age, but even those that are sympathetic, again, like Price and Joshi were sympathetic to Lovecraft, but because they viewed him only through the lens of the Cthulhu mythos, they basically just saw this tortured soul, which in one sense he was, let's be clear, right? But like on the other hand, there's this deeper substratum of a sort of like mystic aristocratic spirit that is being expressed in the dream cycle, which, given that Carter's the alter ego of Lovecraft, I think we can make a case is the true Lovecraft and the true meaning of his work.
I think that's absolutely right. And it's interesting when you see all this modern scholarship on Lovecraft, especially low tier scholarship, the type of thing think piece articles that you get if you just look up Lovecraft sort of casually, right? And they talk about how deluded he was to have seen himself as this aristocrat when actually he was poor, and he was not this figure. But the dream cycle shows he's an aristocrat of the soul. Like he has that drive to higher things, higher in the sense of, well, this is actually what comes through in the Silver Key, and particularly through the gates of the Silver Key, right? Higher is in transcendent, as in unification with this. I need a better word than hyper reality, because that means something else. But this plane which encapsulates, transcendent is probably better. This plane which encapsulates but is not limited by our worldly concerns. So I think you're right that the scholarship on Lovecraft the man is particularly hobbled by its failure to incorporate the dream cycle.
Right, because when you look at, okay, I'm trying to find the part when, yeah, here we go. This is actually probably a kind of Arthurian nod, because in the Arthurian mythos, there's the Siege Perilous, the seat perilous that only the one predestined to find the Holy Grail can sit in. And of course, Galahad then, well, I think in the earlier legends it's Percival, but then Galahad in more recent legends sits on the Siege Perilous, the seat reserved for him. So when he goes into the world between the snake pit and the gate, there's that in-between world where he meets the guide. We read, Carter saw now that one of the pedestals was vacant, and a gesture of the most ancient one told him it was reserved for him. He saw also another pedestal, taller than the rest, and at the center of the oddly curved line, neither semicircle nor ellipse, parabola nor hyperparabola, which they formed. Thus he guessed was the guide's own throne. Moving and rising in a manner hardly definable, Carter took his seat, and as he did so, he saw that the guide was also likewise seated himself. So there's this sort of like seat reserved for him. And prior to that, the other statues or creatures say, we salute you, most ancient one, and you, Randolph Carter, whose daring has made you one of us. So there's this sort of like transcendent seat of honor reserved for the great dreamer. We also see this theme in the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, because it talks about the old gods who destroyed Barzai the Wise. Prior to Randolph Carter, only Kuranes, I think, was the only other guy who had made it through that test and survived.
Yes, I think there were two, and the only one who's named is Kuranes. Yeah, and that would be the only people who had crossed the gulf between the stars, that is, visited a dream world other than that of Earth. And that might be what the quest would entail. Ultimately, Carter himself doesn't do that, right? I think that he's being sort of spirited into the inner void until he realizes the fact that he is able to wake up if he so chooses, and so not be consumed.
Yeah. So there's that. Again, there's so many elements that play off of each other that Lovecraft incorporates. And that's what I love, that layered richness. Now, we can't talk about the dream cycle without talking about the cats of Ulthar, because they're introduced in the cats of Ulthar, but they play an important role in the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath. So I've already mentioned the theory that Lovecraft might have had toxoplasmosis for his love of cats. But what do you make of the cats of Ulthar?
It does. He waxes poetic about how great cats are several times, which I do think was just a little bit of self-indulgence on that one, in that he just particularly likes them. But it does introduce a lot of things that will be relevant later in the dream cycle. So we meet the little boy Atal, who also appears in The Other Gods as he accompanies Barzai on his ill-fated quest, although Atal has the wisdom to not attempt to gaze upon the other gods, and so he is not destroyed. But also then he's a fairly important figure in the Dream Quest, in that Carter meets him early on. At this point, he's an old sage. And it's interesting how time passes in the Dreamlands, because as you mentioned, he's a small boy in the Cats of Ulthar. He's a young man in the other gods. And then in the Dream Quest, he's very old. I think it says he's 300 years old. And Carter gets him drunk and gets some information off him that he uses to further his quest there. So we're introduced to him. We're introduced to Hatheg Kla, the mountain on which the gods dance, which is referenced several places. So I think in terms of the Dream Quest itself, it introduces, one of the main things it does is introduce those, the character of Atal, Hatheg Kla. And let's see, what else do I have here? It has a few other references, I believe, to other... Oh, nope, never mind. Those are actually historical references. So, oh yeah, one thing that might be interesting is Ulthar is very reminiscent of the Latin word ultor. Maybe it's ultar, I'm trying to read my own handwriting here, which means avenger. Lovecraft probably would have known that, so that's probably not an accident.
Well, it's interesting you brought this up, right? Because he gets Atal drunk, right? Now, what's interesting is what happens when he goes to the port city. The moon beasts, half human, quasi-human agents get him drunk and then Shanghai him. So what's interesting is this seems to be a sort of like, this isn't surprising, right? Because he's sort of fond of his Puritan forebears. And so we read the Christian conception of justice in Matthew 7:2, for with what judgment you judge, you will be judged. And with what measure you use, it will likewise be measured back to you. So remember, Lovecraft even says he did a very wicked thing in getting Atal drunk. So this very wicked thing that he does is then later done to him.
I hadn't made that connection, but he does. He gets a sort of ironic punishment for it, doesn't he? And I wonder what to make of that. The fact that because they try the same thing, or actually they succeed, don't they, later on in the Dream Quest with the ghouls. Mm-hmm. They end up capturing the ghouls via the same method. And when they do, they drink this, I think he says it's a wine of some kind, out of this ruby decanter. So I'm not sure what to make of that fact, or if it is relevant, but to be drinking this thing out of this, deep red ruby decanter, which robs you of your faculties and enables you to be taken to the moon to be enslaved.
Right. It's interesting. And we mentioned this in our last episode, but I think it bears mentioning again, especially since of all the mean-spirited commentary on Lovecraft. Even though a lot of Lovecraftian horror deals with, in the Cthulhu mythos, deals with the other, even the human other. So like you've got like black cultists in Louisiana in the Call of Cthulhu. You've got immigrants in some East Coast city in the horror at Red Hook. The idea of kidnapping and slavery, which that's the implication these like low tier intelligence critics are making. Oh, that's just a slippery slope to slavery. We see in the Dream Quest for Unknown Kadath that Lovecraft does not think this is a good thing. And in fact, there's warnings to the port city to not have dealings with these people because of what they do, but they like, what was it, the ivory that's sold or something, so they're not willing to quit.
Yeah, it's the rubies, actually. The same thing as the, yeah. So, yeah, and in fact, it's not the moon beasts themselves who come to that port city, which is called Dilathleen, I think, which sounds very much like something from Morrowind. Dilathleen, yeah. It's the moon beasts themselves don't come. It's their slaves, the goat men, right? These sort of vaguely Arabian guys that they wear turbans. They're kind of swarthy, and they are goat-like. And so I don't remember if they have like hooves, but I remember he depicts them as goat men. Anyway, they are themselves rather appalling, and he doesn't like them. However, he is not happy about the fact that they're the slaves of these moon beasts. He doesn't seem to have a positive view of slavery at all. Now, as an aristocrat, he wouldn't have a problem with the notion of, say, peasantry, which it would be offensive to modern sensibilities. But that is a different thing.
Well, the other thing too is he's flying on the Shantak at the end, or the Night Gaunts. I mean, at the end, he's flying over Lang again, and he sees the natural home of the Goatmen, and he realized they were kidnapped. That wasn't even their natural existence. Naturally, they lived on the plateau, and they had these fires on the plateau that they danced to. And it's interesting too because isn't the way that Goatmen were described seems kind of similar to the way that Wilbur Whately was described in the Dunwich Horror. A little bit.
Yeah, there's hybridity there. Lovecraft calls a lot upon hybridity as a source of horror, and he's not the only one, because hybridity is an aspect of sort of disillusion, right? It's distance from the center. Even just think of human populations, right? At border towns, you are going to have people from both sides intermingling. Now, taken to its extreme, you get, say, the edge of existence, where you have intermingling between our reality and, say, whatever is outside it. And the Dunwich Horror goes into that fairly explicitly.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think an important standalone story in the dream cycle, which sort of encapsulates this idea of a rise and fall of a civilization, hubris, is the doom that came to Sarnath, where the conquerors come in, get rid of the lizard or fish people and the Bakrug idol. And then, of course, the first high priest sees something that scares him to death, but nobody takes it seriously. And then for like 1,000 years, they just have this amazing empire, and then it falls to some sort of a curse that was pronounced early on. And there's just a lot of elements there that are interesting. Like it says that the throne was of a single piece of ivory, of which animal no one could tell because it was so big. Also, the stones that were hewn to make the city must have come from somewhere else because there were no stones of such type in the area. And I think there was some stone or resource that was out of the ground that made Sarnath like a trading hub. And after, like, when the men of the north come down to observe it, all they find are water lizards, and they don't find anything that was left of Sarnath. And I think also, aren't the blonde men from the north also the same guys in Polaris?
Yes, I believe they are. They are called... Where are they from? Are they the men from Olathoe? Oh, Men of Lomar. It's the Men of Lomar, I think.
Right, because in Polaris, it's basically Caucasian men fighting off these like yellow squat creatures. And when he wakes up from his dream, they're like, "Oh no, that land has been ruled by the yellow squat creatures for 10,000 years."
That's right. And I would want to touch back on Sarnath. You had touched on the throne. So the way Sarnath is described, it is very much in an Evolian golden age. We see that the priests are subject to the king, which is an aspect of the golden age in which the king is also the head priest. You see this in the Roman Empire. That's where our term, what is the term for the emperor that is now used for the pope?
Pontifex Maximus.
Pontifex Maximus, that's right. Which refers to a bridge, right? That's the role of the solar king, is to function as this bridge between the transcendent and the material. So we also see that in the symbolism of the throne, which is made of gold. Gold, I mean, it's the golden age, but also gold partakes of the sun. And the sun is a stable unity that gives off light of its own, right? It is a polar symbol, which we see in that single piece of ivory that you mentioned. It is completely uniform. It is not becoming in any way. It is fully being. So it's interesting then that Sarnath seems to be destroyed at the height of its powers, right? Because there's no long, slow decline through the ages here. It is in the golden age and destroyed. And I wonder what to make of that. It sounds somewhat like the Tower of Babel, perhaps.
Yeah. Okay. I was just looking at the two accounts. I was mistaken. They're not the same men. The men of Lomar have gray eyes, and then the men of Falona have blue. So they're actually different groups. I know so many of these stories fold into each other. I thought maybe there was a connection, but not in this case. Let's see. Well, what's interesting, let's go through the gates of the Silver Key, because that's where we find, the Silver Key. So first of all, the Silver Key, it's return to the past, where we learn that the Carters themselves, going back to like Elizabethan times, were essentially dreamers, wizards, magi, and that Randolph Carter is only the most recent incarnation of that group. We get some more backstory to Carter. He realizes he has a key, I think that his uncle or father gave him, and then he uses that to go back in time into this dimension outside of time, and then it ends. And then through the gates of the Silver Key, we see what it's like when he's in that dimension between time, and he eventually realizes his own persona throughout all of time and all of space. And now what's interesting is that the Carter facet is not just a human, it's even non-human animal intelligences. And so that's interesting what to make of that, right? Because we also have in the Mountains of Madness that Lovecraft considers at the end the elder things as men of a different kind from a different age, even though they are basically half animal, half plant. So he seems to have a kind of it's kind of weird, right? If an alien intelligence reaches a certain level, he almost has like a Kantian, dare I say it, Star Trek ethic, where like, okay, you're at our level of intelligence, we'll treat you like one of us.
Yes, he does seem so, particularly in Through the Gates of the Silver Key. I'll just read the passage there briefly where he talks about that. He says, "There were Carters in settings belonging to every known and suspected age of Earth's history and to remoter ages of earthly entity transcending knowledge, suspicion, and credibility. Carters of forms, both human and non-human, vertebrate and invertebrate, conscious and mindless, animal and vegetable. And more, there were Carters having nothing in common with earthly life, but moving outrageously amidst backgrounds of other planets and systems and galaxies and cosmic continua." So he certainly has an expansive view of the degree to which there can be continuity of spirit here, which I do think, is very unusual for a man who's cast only as finding horror in the other, right? Like he does, but I mean, is he wrong? I mean, the other can be quite horrifying, especially when it wants to eat you.
Right. But there seems to be this contextualization, right? There are elements of Lovecraft's work where the other is horrifying, but then there are also elements where the other is a part of you, which can be horrifying. Like, what was it? The story of Arthur Germain?
Yes, facts concerning the late Arthur Germain and his family.
Well, yeah, that was horrifying, but in other contexts, it's not. So the sort of solidarity that Dyer has with the elder things at the end, when he realizes they both are fleeing, they both have to fear the Shoggoth. So in fearing the same other thing, they have solidarity with each other. And then with Randolph Carter through the Gate with the Silver Key, he has a sort of solidarity with other existences. Well, that kind of perspective of solidarity with other intelligences, other species, we also find in The Color Out of Space, where, all these people that have their minds transplanted by the Yithians, he mentions all of these different groups. And in one sense, they're all in the same library talking to each other, while the Yithians have their real bodies. So he's already sort of created this precedent for... again, it's a limited solidarity. We're talking about now intelligences, not just brutes. But it's interesting.
Yeah, it's sort of like you touched on in our last conversation, how the remark in the Dream Quest about ghouls, about how like you can get along with ghouls and you can work with ghouls, but they're not the most pleasant of company. And that seems to be the nature of a lot of these things. Although it's particularly interesting as well in Kadath about the night gaunts. Right, so the night gaunts are apparently an artifact of a nightmare that Lovecraft had as a small child. And they're mentioned in the Fungi from Yuggoth cycle, as well as in Kadath, and they may come up elsewhere. I think he does mention them elsewhere. So, I mean, they end up being a recurring aspect. But notice that even though they they might end up killing him in Kadath, right? Because they snatch him away and drop him in the Vale of Nath, where he can get eaten by bowls. He's able to get his way out of there. But ultimately, he works alongside them, and they carry him to Kadath itself.
Yeah. Well, I'll just quote the part you're referring to because it's so good. And Carter shook the paws of those repulsive beasts, thanking them for their help and sending his gratitude to the beast which once was Pikmin, but could not help sighing with pleasure when they left, for a ghoul is a ghoul, and at best an unpleasant companion for man. That's just so well put. It's so well put. But the other thing that's interesting as I guess a continuity thing, because like Lovecraft has a lot of Easter eggs and such. He wrote Out of the Aeons he ghost wrote it for some female author, but he Chandraputra comes back, which is of course Randolph Carter, and it's a short paragraph, and I quote: "They were scholarly and intelligent visitors too, despite the puerility of the article. The pictures had spoken for themselves, and many persons of mature attainments sometimes see the pillar by accident. I recall one strange character who appeared during November, a dark turbaned and bushily bearded man with a labored, unnatural voice, curiously expressionless face, clumsy hands covered with his absurd white mittens, who gave a squalid West End address and called himself Swami Chandraputra. This fellow was unbelievably erudite in occult lore and seemingly profoundly and solemnly moved by the resemblance of the hieroglyphs on the scroll to certain signs and symbols of an elder world about which he had professed vast intuitive knowledge. Also, Etienne de Marini is mentioned. What's interesting is this event takes place in 1932, whereas the events of Through the Gate with the Silver Key occur in 1930. So what is interesting to speculate here is, one, we can assume the Zakaiba facet was brought back under control, but hadn't yet shed the form for 2 years. It's like there's not much to go on here, and then Chandraputra and Randolph Carter doesn't show up anymore.
Yeah, so to fill in a little bit for people who are watching who may not have the whole story on hand, Chandraputra is Carter, as you mentioned. However, it's Carter inhabiting the body of one of these other Carters from across the cosmos, this one actually being this alien from the distant past. And in Through the Gate of the Silver Key, Carter found himself transplanted into this body, and ultimately in the conflict with the other Carter facet, Zakauba, you mentioned, who formerly inhabited it. And so it seemed that his goal in Through the Gates of the Silver Key was to acquire the papyrus that had been with the Silver Key, which he left in the car in the story, The Silver Key itself, not realizing that he would need that. So yeah, I do wonder, apparently he failed to get his hands on that. I do wonder why. As you mentioned, we don't have much to go on.
Yeah, and Out of the Aeons was published in 1935, the year Lovecraft. He died in 37, right?
I have to look that up. I don't actually have that on hand.
I'll look that up. Yeah, he died in 37, so we don't have any more writings. Well, I know why he was looking at. Okay, I'm not going to go into the details of Out of the Aeons, but there is a scroll that is contained in Out of the Aeons as a part of the narrative device. So one could plausibly think that Chandraputra thinks it might be his, the one that he lost, right? Now, this is what's interesting, right? Again, we've already highlighted the fact that there's this one-dimensional, chud tier reading by the left of Lovecraft is this, just tortured soul that just mindlessly hates people. What does it say that the last manifestation of his alter ego is an alien insect intelligence masquerading as a South Asian?
That does seem rather incongruous, doesn't it? Though I wonder to what degree it calls back to The Outsider, because in The Outsider as well, the horrifying entity is the protagonist, the narrator, the main character that we know there. So you could say it's something to do with Lovecraft's own sort of feeling out of place in some way. And there are a bunch of readings of The Outsider that go into this. And I'm sure, to some effect he did. He certainly saw himself as a man out of time. And we see that in some of his characters as well. Like in the case of Charles Dexter Ward, I want to say. I forget who the narrator was on that one, but he also seemed like Willett.
Yeah, the physician. Yeah.
He also seemed like a sort of kindred spirit, you know, antiquarian, man out of time type. So,
well, in fact, in the in the case of Charles Dexter Ward, Willett makes reference to Randolph Carter as a friend.
He does. Yep, he's mentioned, as well as the sign of Thoth is mentioned there as well in Kerwin's dungeon, I believe. And the sign of Thoth appears in the Dreamland at the connection between the Vale of Nath and the liminal woods that that Carter goes through on his way into the Dreamland.
Interesting. So well, okay. I think the reading of Zakaiba Chandragupta is that at a higher level, Randolph Carter, the dreamer, is realizing that the archetype that he represents transcends the Anglo-Saxon Homo sapien male. It could be, a non-intelligent bug, right? But what he's basically doing is saying that in making his alter ego a insect wizard, pretending to be a South Asian in our world, is sort of saying that at some level this archetype his archetype, sort of aristocratic dreamer archetype, can exist almost anywhere. And in order to illustrate that, he picks two very unlikely personas.
Yes. Now he does mention in the Through the Gates of the Silver Key the sort of magical Orientalism of the Hindus, right? And that they're known to have these extraordinary capabilities is something that he calls on there. But I think that's exactly his point. And it goes to the excerpt that I read a few minutes ago, right? That the dreamer archetype, as you say, or Carter facet, whatever you want to call it, it seems to be completely divorced from the physical avatar. So it could be, what did he say? Conscious and mindless animal and vegetable. So that's pretty extreme.
Well, and this is why I get so frustrated with the current level of Lovecraft scholarship. This sort of like crude rendering of him as a sort of like caricature of a redneck racist is completely refuted by Through the Gate of the Silver Key.
It is. He is a genius esoteric racist. Thank you.
Well, but see, that's the point, right? They just aren't. It's just intentionally bad. That's the ultimate problem. The scholarship is intentionally bad.
Absolutely agree. It's totally in bad faith. I mean, we see this every day, right? It's outrage porn is what it is. And particularly because Lovecraft was fairly unknown and then he became known. Well, if it's known, we got to deconstruct it. We got to break it down. We got to cast it in our vulgar modern frame and reject any sort of transcendent quality that it might have, which is exactly what he's railing against in these stories.
Well, exactly. And this isn't to fit Lovecraft into our modern sensibilities, but only to fit him within his own context, which they refuse to do based on a sort of, cheap yellow journalism. Actually, there is something from Out of the Aeons I want to read, which gets into this. What we've been talking about, the sort of like yellow journalism quality. And Out of the Aeons. Okay. Yeah, this when the yellow press makes hints, they are ready to swallow anything, but when a stupendous and abnormal revelation is actually made, they laugh it aside as a lie. For the sake of general sanity, it's probably better so. I mean, that's the thing, right? That's the thing. His critics are the yellow press. They'll swallow anything, and they'll ignore anything that's actually true and call it a lie.
Yeah, I mean, the first part of that is like right out of Pericles' funeral oration, right? And Nietzsche touches on this as well. It's the incredulity of the lesser for the greater that I have to dig out from Thucydides because the way he puts it is so great. But it's something along the lines of when men see something that they cannot achieve, then they start to doubt that it's even possible, something along those lines. I like, though, that the second half of that, he says, it's probably better that it's even not so. And I think that's the aristocrat coming through, that like these yellow journalists, they are not people to be initiated into the mysteries. They're simply not of the type who can handle it.
Right. And so the elitism or classism or whatever you want to say that Lovecraft has, I think if you look at the dream cycle, is properly oriented in a sort of spiritual awareness, for lack of a better word. And given the diversity of Carter facets, almost anybody or thing could be spiritually aware. But the difference between those who are spiritually aware and those who are not is greater than the species difference, such that he feels solidarity with these other races and species who are spiritually aware.
Exactly. It's straight up Evola's race of the spirit. It's exactly that. And I think you're right that his elitism is properly oriented, right? Because the alternative is a rejection of value, which is what Nietzsche was talking about and what Lovecraft was railing against in the excerpt that you read from the Silver Key. So he holds value, and he properly construes things as better or worse. He is rejecting the lower material aspects. Now, that's not to say that there's never a relationship between the material and the transcendent. There probably is. They are related, but they're not the same. And that's what's crucial.
Right. And I don't remember, this is outside of the dream cycle. There's a story about a decayed lineage of Dutch property holders in New England that become these like semi-apes that, I forget the name of the story. You know what I'm talking about, right?
I know the story you're talking about. Yeah, they live like in the caves underneath their former land holding, right?
Yes. And I don't
remember the title, but yeah.
They've decayed to a level that makes them on par with the barbarous races that Lovecraft abhors in other parts of his work. So one, he's actually conceding that yes, even the exalted, European race could fall to such a point. And that story is a key element of that. And so to just say, Lovecraft doesn't like immigrants, as if that just encapsulates the whole thing. It's just a very one-dimensional bad faith perspective of Lovecraft's position.
Yeah, it comes from radical egalitarianism, right? It's the notion that if you hold any standard of value, that you must be, you must be a bad person, is what it comes down to, because that's what they're accusing him of being.
Yeah, which again, I just don't find that very useful. But what I would argue, though, and I guess now we're nearing the end of the hour, I guess what I'll summarize all this as, given that Ranulph Carter is his alter ego, and the gates of the Silver Key itself describes his discontent with the physical world of the early 20th century and the primacy of dream, Randolph Carter, specifically his stories, the Dream Quest of Unokadath, the Silver Key, Through the Gates of the Silver Key, but more broadly, the dream cycle itself, could be seen as a kind of silver key, if you will, to understand the corpus of Lovecraft's work.
I think you're absolutely right. They give a new, to use another symbol from Through the Gates of the Silver Key, it's another facet of this higher dimensional work, right? It's another way of sort of slicing the cone. So you could slice the cone and get a circle. You could slice the cone and get an ellipse. You could slice the cone and get a parabola. All of these different matters of perspective. So I think you're absolutely right that this one, the dream cycle itself, is such a mechanism of interpreting the whole body of work in a fuller way.
All right. Well, thank you again, the Doomsman. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Todd. Appreciate you having me on again.
This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fog podcast, signing off.